Well, we're about 5 minutes past, so we'll go ahead and get started with the presentation. I may need to flip back and forth here a few times to see if anybody else is trying to join. But thank you all for attending the webinar. Looking forward to presenting today. This is going to be similar to those of you who are familiar with my program to the webinar I gave last year, but it sounds like we've got some new folks on the line too. So at any time, please feel free to jump in with questions. I'll take a few breaks for questions, or you can use that chat function as well for questions. But this webinar is for the Non-Point Source Program Grants Application Training. Again, as you can see, this is being recorded. I will post the recording to the website, either if not later today, then tomorrow or Wednesday of this week. So if you can't catch all of it, it will be posted so you can catch the rest of it. So we'll jump into it. Again, this is for the grant going out for federal fiscal year FY20 for both of our grants, which are the Section 319 and 205J grants. This is my contact information. Feel free to get a hold of me by phone or email if you have questions after the webinar. Housekeeping things, we are having some technical difficulties, obviously, so thank you for calling in by phone. I don't think you need to worry about muting your computer audio, but please mute your phone if you're not speaking. Questions, you can use the chat function, or I think with this small of a group, we'll have plenty of time for questions at the end or during the break. So the purpose of this webinar to provide information for people who are interested in submitting a proposal for one of our grants for FY20. Again, with a group this small, I think we'll have plenty of time for questions and answers. So now is a good time if you've got general questions that you'd like me to answer, or if you've got any project-specific questions that you'd like to throw out there, I'd be happy to answer those too. For those of you who have applied in the past, I used to do a pre-review opportunity for draft proposals. I have not been doing that in recent years just due to the level of competition, so there won't be a pre-review opportunity. I'm happy to answer questions today for more procedural things, but I can't provide any kind of review of draft sections of your proposal as I've done in years past. So what we'll cover today, we'll go over an overview of the grants. I know some of you are familiar with those grants and some of you may be new to my program. I'll talk about what information is required in the proposal, how to submit the proposal, some tips for submitting a competitive proposal, and then just review the application process and timeline. So if you can bear with me, I'm going to just flip back real quick, make sure nobody else is trying to join. Looks like we are okay. So back to it. So we've got two grants available through my program, which is in the Wyoming Department of Environmental Quality, Water Quality Division, called the Non-Point Source Pollution Program. Both of these funds are awarded to the state under the Clean Water Act, so they are federal funding, and they're provided to states to address non-point source pollution. The primary grant that we have is the Section 319 grant, and these are projects that will reduce non-point sources of pollution to surface and groundwater. Non-point source pollution, I think probably those of you on the call are familiar with that. Unregulated pollution that comes from large diffuse areas, from surface runoff, or irrigation, or also things like stream restoration, projects where we've got erosive banks. All of that falls under non-point source pollution, things that are not regulated. Our smaller grant is the Section 205J grant, and that is reserved for water quality management planning projects. We don't do any on-the-ground work with those. Those are strictly planning. Where can you find the proposal information? Probably most of you have already navigated there, but everything is posted on my Non-Point Source Grants Resources website at that link. Or if you navigate to my homepage, there's a menu on the left-hand side with grant resources. If you click that, it'll bring up a downloads table with all the important documents for you to review. For each grant, really two important documents: the memorandum, which is the announcement of the RFP, as well as guidance information for applying for that grant, and then an application form. Again, for those of you who've applied in the past, I have significantly shortened and streamlined the application form. I did that starting last year. I got absolutely no complaints for doing that, and I think it worked out better for everybody, so we're continuing that for FY20. So just one application form per grant this year. But there is information, especially for 319, that it's helpful to review. We'll go into the sage-grouse requirements. There's a link to the Game and Fish sage-grouse data website that might be useful if you're in sage-grouse core area habitat. There's a document called the 9 Key Elements of Watershed-Based Planning. We'll talk about what that is. There's a summary of what watershed-based plans we have in Wyoming. That might be useful if you're not familiar with watershed-based plans. And then you can also take a look at the 319 evaluation and scoring sheet that's used by my board members to evaluate proposals, as well as some additional guidelines that I give them as part of proposal review. So just information to help you understand how your proposal will be evaluated. The general timeline, the RFP was issued a couple Fridays ago on the 12th, training webinar obviously today, and the proposals will be due on September 20th. After that, mid-September through October, I will review the proposals and send my evaluations and copies of the proposals to the task force, which is my board, a board of citizens appointed by the governor to review these proposals and make funding recommendations. In late October to early December, we will have the non-point source task force meeting. The date is still to be determined, but it's looking probably November-ish for that meeting. And at that meeting, anybody who submitted a proposal has the opportunity to present. And really, that is the best way to explain to the task force what your project is about and why you should get funding for your project. And then we do have a long lag time. Unfortunately, this is one of the tough things about my program, but just especially for those of you not familiar with it, we make funding recommendations in the fall. The federal allocation typically doesn't come out until the spring or summer of 2020, so we typically don't issue agreements and make that funding available until the spring or summer of next year. So just something to plan for time-wise. And I do have to give this disclaimer. We do the best that we can anticipating how much federal funding will come through and when it will come through, but we're always subject to congressional and presidential federal budget changes in that approval process and what our actual allocation ends up being. So if you haven't already registered for that listserv with the link there, I'd recommend doing so. If there's any drastic changes to the 319 grant for FY20, that's where the information will be distributed. So I will stop there. Any questions with kind of the general big picture stuff, feel free to just pipe up on the phone. I will switch back here real quickly, see if anybody else joined. Okay. All right, not seeing anything and not hearing anything. I'm just going to keep cruising on. So we'll start with the Section 319 grant because that is really the biggest grant that we deal with, and then I'll get into the Section 205J grant later. So again, 319, we're looking to reduce non-point source pollution through voluntary projects to protect or improve water quality. This is a reimbursement-only grant, meaning we can't give out funds ahead of time. We have to see proof that the work was done, expenditures made, and then we'll reimburse the project sponsors. At least 40% of the total project cost must be non-federal match, and I'll get into that a little bit later when we start talking about the budget, but keep that in mind for 319 projects. Projects that are eligible are those that demonstrate the real potential to improve water quality by reducing non-point source pollution. So again, we're looking for primarily on-the-ground work that's going to improve water quality. But there's many different types of project types that are eligible: watershed restoration, protection, outreach and education, monitoring and assessment, planning, technical assistance, and groundwater. So broad eligibility, really anything dealing with non-point source pollution is eligible, but we'll talk about program priorities here in a minute. Things that we cannot fund would be research, anything involving a regulatory action, point sources, which would be, a facility like a wastewater treatment plant that's managed under a permit, We can't fund projects where the primary benefit is increased production, although that might be a co-benefit, and we definitely want projects where it's a win-win for the producer and for water quality. We can't purchase real estate, and obviously nothing that would be in violation of local, state, or federal regulations. Pretty much anybody can apply for Section 319 funds. It's very broad applicability. Conservation districts have been our primary project sponsors, but we've had many other groups sponsor projects. City and county governments, nonprofit organizations, state agencies, even other federal agencies. So pretty much anybody can apply. The only limitation is that if a private individual applies, those are limited to demonstration projects, but that rarely occurs. And actually, I don't think I've ever seen that happen yet in my time in the program. So how much Section 319 funding is available and how much should I apply for? That's one of the most common questions that I get. I am estimating that the maximum that we will see for FY20 will be $845,000. That is based on what we received this year in FY19, plus a little bit of reduction. We've seen a little bit of up and down over the years, so that's a conservative estimate of how much we're looking at statewide under the 319 grant for next year. There is no maximum project amount cap. We used to cap project requests at, I think, $400,000. That has been removed. To give you a sense of funding awards from last year the task force recommended between $37,500 and $300,000 to projects. So it's quite a range. It's hard to advise people how much to apply for. I will say in previous years, sponsors could more qualify for the $200,000 to $400,000 project range because we've become so much more competitive. I'm seeing probably typically more towards $100,000 to $200,000 being the average for a watershed restoration project. But request what you need is my general advice. Be as cost effective as possible. And you will probably be asked by the task force, how would you phase your project if we can't give you full funding? Meaning if you ask for $300,000, we could only give you $200,000, how could you make that work? So again, the best advice I can give people is really request what you need, but think through how you could phase your project and make sure you're being as cost effective as you can. In terms of priority for 319 funding, the highest priority that we're looking for are watershed restoration projects, and these are projects that implement on-the-ground conservation practices to restore impaired water bodies. Impaired water bodies being those water bodies that are on our 303D list per the most recent integrated report. For those projects, we do need a watershed-based plan or an alternative plan, and I'll get into that in just a minute here. The next highest projects that we have are watershed protection projects, and these are also on-the-ground projects, but where we're working to protect a water body that is not impaired. So either a high-quality water body or a water body that's not impaired but might be seeing some degradation, and we're trying to get out ahead of that degradation and prevent an impairment. So those are eligible as well. And in those cases, you would also need a watershed-based plan or some kind of alternative plan, which I'll describe here. And then finally, low-priority projects would be everything else. Outreach and education, monitoring assessment, planning, technical assistance, and groundwater projects. Does not mean that these activities are not important, but just based on national and state priorities, these projects typically rank out lower than the other two types. You don't need any kind of watershed plan for those kinds of projects, and I do recommend that those projects be limited to about $50,000 or less. That is not set in stone. That's just based on experience in terms of how much funding we have available and what those projects are typically competitive for. So let me talk a little bit more about watershed-based planning. So again, if you're doing on-the-ground work on an impaired water body, a watershed restoration project, those must be implemented in accordance with a watershed-based plan. This is what I was referring to about that 9 key elements of watershed-based planning. These are requirements set at the national level by EPA about what these watershed-based plans have to have in them before we can put on-the-ground funding towards watershed restoration projects. A lot of times these are done through our TMDL process, through our TMDL implementation plans. or there's conservation districts, for example, who have written watershed-based plans outside of the TMDL process. But that's where there is the summary on the website that outlines where our impaired water bodies are and whether or not we've got a watershed-based plan. But bottom line, if you're not sure, give me a call. This is definitely something that, if you're not sure about how this applies to your project, definitely something I can help answer questions on to make sure you're eligible and that you're in accordance with that watershed plan. We do have a little bit of ability per some flexibility they gave at the national level in our guidance that we can use an alternative plan in some cases. So if it's an emergency situation or a very small scale problem, really doesn't necessitate a whole watershed-based plan, we can make some exceptions there and go with a lesser amount of planning. And that alternative planning requirement would apply to our watershed protection projects as well. Those medium priority projects where it's on the ground work to protect a water body that is not impaired. Those would also need an alternative plan. The minimum required information that we need in that plan would be an identification of causes and sources, goals for how that project makes progress towards those goals, a schedule and milestones, your proposed management measures, and finally some kind of monitoring component. So we could spend a lot of time talking about watershed-based plans across the state and some of the details, but if you think an alternative plan applies to your project, please let me know. This is, again, an area that I'd be happy to talk with you about to answer any questions. And these alternative plans don't have to be a standalone document. You may be able to reference other planning documents done in your area, water development studies, city planning documents, county planning documents. There may be other documents in existence that can help you meet this planning requirement. Okay, so what do you need to submit for the 319 proposal? Again, it's been simplified in recent years, so all you need is the application form, one or more project maps, and then, if applicable, a Sage-Grouse Core Area consultation letter. And I'll get into that in a minute. Please don't include other attachments. My board members have specified that they don't want a lot of information. They just want to see the proposal. I'm no longer requiring that detailed Excel budget workbook that I've required in past years, as some of you are familiar with. And I'm no longer requiring letters of support with the proposal. Again, the task force just said, hey, we don't need to see those. We just want to focus on the proposal. But if you are recommended for funding, I will work with you to put together a more detailed project plan and a more detailed budget justification. But again, because we've become more competitive in recent years, we've streamlined the application. If you get funding, I'll work with you on the next steps to do some of the more detailed planning. The application form is just a 9-page fillable PDF form. Please do not modify the format. You can use Adobe Reader, which is a free download if you don't have it. Be sure to download it and save it to a location on your computer, after which, at that point, it can be edited and saved. If you just download it and don't save it first and start editing it, your changes may not be saved. So please download it and save it first. And if you are using a Mac, do open it with Adobe and not Preview. I've learned from experience that opening it in Preview causes some complications with the functionality. So make sure that you do get that free download Adobe Reader and open it with Adobe. So this is what the application form looks like. I will walk through a few of the sections to give out some tips and some highlights here. Project title, keep it brief. You're going to have to write that many, many times throughout project management, so don't make it too long. Otherwise, you'll drive yourself nuts. Project synopsis. What I'm trying to get people to do here is really describe in public-friendly terms, people who are not familiar with technical water quality terms and acronyms, what is your project about? And this is something that I'll just copy and paste from here to use in outreach materials to really think about, you know, if this was the only thing somebody was going to read about your project, what would you want them to know? And again, speak to the public, not necessarily a technical audience. Applicant information is who is going to sponsor the project. This is the entity that we will enter into the legal cooperative agreement with. Project location, we need watershed names and hydrologic unit codes. If you're not familiar with those HUC codes, please feel free to pick up the phone and give me a call, or there's an EPA tool out there called Surf Your Watershed. Actually, I think that might be a little outdated. I think that got phased out and they replaced it with something else. But if you need HUT codes, don't hesitate to give me a call. For the question about are any of the water bodies impaired, if you're not familiar with impaired water bodies through our classification system and our integrated report, there's more information in the RFP memo, or feel free to give me a call. And then finally, for the project map, we're just looking for relevant information. We don't need to see every detail of the watershed unless it's relevant to your project. If you have a lot of information to provide, please provide those in multiple maps, but keep it to the 8.5 by 11 page size. And also make sure to point out where in Wyoming your project is located. My board members are from all over the state, so they may be very familiar with their area. But if they're not familiar with your specific watershed, it helps to kind of do a little call-out box to show where in Wyoming we're talking about. Next page, a lot of check boxes here, pretty straightforward, indicating what project type it is, the pollutant source is addressed, and then the pollutants addressed. Project time frame, just indicate a start date when you hope to start the project and an end date when you think you'll wrap it up. Again, keep in mind that we don't anticipate funds being available until spring or summer of 2020, and the maximum for 319 projects is 4 years. The projects will need to be completed by December 2024. Project purpose. This is, when I was doing that optional pre-review in years past, was really the key area where I think people could improve their proposal. They forget to explain why their project is important. Why should it be funded? And again, speak in terms understandable to the general public. Sometimes you've got to use acronyms and technical terms, but really make it clear to somebody in a non-technical term, why is your project important to the state of Wyoming? How will it benefit water quality? Project scope, really we're just looking for a simple explanation here about what your project will do to address the water quality problem that you've just identified in the justification above. And emphasis on the word do, and they're looking for specific activities that will help you reach that goal. So stay away from very generic terms about, think of an example. So as a very extreme example, if you just say, well, we hope to improve water quality through agricultural best management practices, that doesn't tell them anything. Be specific about what BMPs you're doing, how many, when are they going to be implemented, what's the impact of water quality. The more specificity that you can provide here, the better. Next section is about project plans. This refers back to those watershed-based plans that we talked about, TMDLs, other planning documents. And here again, if you have any questions, let me know. Watershed planning can get really complicated, unfortunately, I think, and we all call planning documents different things. Really what we want to know is, what is your roadmap? What is your problem? What's your solution? How are you going to get there? How do you know that what you're doing is going to be effective? And this is kind of a key component that they do look at. They're not going to read through all of the planning documents. They're not going to read through the TMDL documents, but they do want to know that you've done your homework. Do you know what's causing the problem, and are you addressing that cause? So again, refer back to the previous slides and the documents on the website for more information about watershed planning, or don't hesitate to pick up the phone and give me a call on this aspect. It is easier to answer questions up front with this section. Next page, project outcomes. Again, be specific here. What are the tangible products, outcomes, and deliverables of your project? What is the environmental benefit? We are a program that is held to an environmental measure of success. I'll get into that here in a minute. So we need more specificity than just we're going to improve water quality. What pollutants? How much? Even if that's a rough estimate. And be product-oriented rather than process-oriented, meaning rather than we're going to implement BMPs, what exactly are you going to implement? We're going to fix 10 septic systems. We're going to put in 5 miles of fence. We're going to put in 2 acres of a wetland complex, things like that. Oops. Project evaluation. So evaluation, again, is kind of a critical aspect of the 319 program because we are ultimately held to a measure of water quality improvement when we report back to the national level. So I am going to step out of the application form here to talk a little bit more about evaluation and monitoring considerations if you do monitor pollutant load reduction estimates in operation and maintenance. So monitoring can be challenging. It's a very challenging part of the 319 program, but it's very important. We can say that we're improving water quality. We can say anecdotally that our projects are working, but when you have data to show it, it really packs a powerful punch. And ultimately what we're trying to get to with the 319 program is watershed restoration, where we've got an impaired water body, we restore it, it's meeting its uses, and we can take it off the 303D list. It's a pretty lofty goal. In the meantime, we really want to capture as much data to show that we are making improvement in water quality. So, in general, projects that implement on-the-ground best management practices must include a monitoring component to evaluate effectiveness. However, there are some cases where monitoring would not be an effective use of funds, and in that case, what we're looking for is a justification for why monitoring won't be conducted. Maybe you've got a 20-year plan and you just need to focus on implementation now, and you'll get to monitoring down the road. Maybe it doesn't make sense to invest a lot in monitoring at this point because you've got so much work to do. Maybe it's a project that just does not lend itself to monitoring, whether due to safety conditions or other conditions, you just can't get out there to actually get water quality data. There's more information in the memo on some hypothetical examples of when monitoring might not be an effective use of funds. But in general, think about how you can collect monitoring data to see, did you accomplish your goals or not? If you don't have baseline data, then definitely think about getting that baseline data set before you implement a project. Think strategically and creatively about what success looks like. And this is something that I've talked to a lot of conservation districts and other sponsors about. Ultimately, we are trying to get to watershed restoration, meaning that maybe a water body now is exceeding criteria. We want to get to the point where it's meeting criteria. That might be a lofty goal, and it may not be something that you're going to show success at in the next few years. But what can you do to show me, and more importantly, your public and your constituents that there's been improvement? Don't underestimate the power of qualitative or semi-quantitative methods. Photo point monitoring can be huge. The examples here are from the Little Snake River Conservation District, Muddy Creek over time. Took many years, but those pictures speak 1,000 words in terms of what improvement happened in that watershed. Definitely encouraging some folks to consider riparian health indices. This would be things like the MIMS monitoring, multiple indicator monitoring, sorry, I'm blanking out on the acronym. But more of the riparian area transect metrics that would show, are you seeing an increase in desirable species? Are you seeing a change in your green line? Some of those, again, qualitative or semi-quantitative metrics that can really tell you a lot over time about how your riparian area is doing. And this might be a quicker indicator of success, and it may take many more years for you to actually see the chemical or biological water quality data improve. So if you'd like to talk about that more, or if you have questions, I can point you in some more directions. But again, think outside the box. We don't have all the answers about how to monitor for success, but it is something that we need to show when we're using public funds for these kinds of projects. So I'm open to innovative ideas on evaluation and monitoring too. And same with information and education activities. We are looking for some explanation of how you know whether those activities are effective. It's a hard question to answer. I will tell you, I have one board member who will definitely ask you, though, if you are proposing to use funds for education activities, he wants to know, well, how do you know if it's working or not? Again, we don't have one standard answer, so think about how you might gauge that. Participation, surveys, interest in cost share projects. Again, don't be afraid to think outside the box there. We are looking for creative solutions. If you do decide to monitor, if you do decide to collect water quality data, clearly think through why you're monitoring and state your objectives. In this case, for the 319 projects, effectiveness monitoring should be one of them. You may or may not be monitoring for use support, meaning that would be monitoring specifically per Wyoming's methods to determine if you're meeting the standard or not. You may not need to do that. You may be too early in the process. If you think you're too far away from complete restoration, don't worry about that and just focus on how you can monitor for effectiveness. Think about if it's feasible to collect the information you need to meet your objectives. Will the results be conclusive? Is your scale appropriate? Meaning if you're doing a few BMPs at a HUC 12 level, but you've got 2 monitoring points at the HUC 8 watershed scale, you may not see changes. Really think about where you're putting your monitoring sites and if that's going to lend you to seeing results or not. Describe your monitoring strategy very simply in your proposal. If you are monitoring, for example, number and location of sites, sampling frequency and timing, parameters, methods, QA/QC, etc. And there's more information in the memo that can kind of point you in the right direction there. If you do monitor, you will need a sampling and analysis plan and a quality assurance project plan at some point. Those do need to be approved by DEQ before you begin monitoring, but you don't need to worry about those with your proposal just before you monitor. Please note that if you do monitor and you use 319 funds to collect data, those data do need to be reported electronically to DEQ at the end of the project. This just comes again from using public funds for monitoring. Those data should be publicly accessible. So ultimately, those data will get uploaded into a national database where the public can access any of those data. I'm thinking through a new process on how to do that this year. It's still a little bit up in the air, but please budget in time and money for these activities, which will generally include taking your data, formatting them in a specific spreadsheet format, and then either submitting them to me or submitting them to a national portal where those data can be uploaded. So stay tuned for more on that, but if you're collecting data, make sure that you factor in that time and money into your budget and your timeline. Finally, hopefully most people are aware, but make sure you are familiar with these 2 Wyoming statutes. The first regarding trespassing to collect data, you will obviously need to have access to any private lands to collect data. And then the Wyoming Public Records Act, again, because this is public funding, records associated with this project are public records. Estimating pollutant load reduction. So this is part of the 319 reporting requirement to Congress. Any projects that do on-the-ground BMP implementation are required to report at the end of the project their load reduction estimates for sediment, nitrogen, and phosphorus. These get aggregated into one lump number that goes into a national database and gets reported to Congress on how the 319 program is doing each year. So I'm looking for each project to report those numbers to me at the end of the project or on an annual basis if you want to do it annually. I don't need estimates for other pollutants, but you can provide them if you have them. These would be for things like E. coli or selenium. I do have some tools to help with that. And the reason I mention it here is that if you do have a way to estimate your pollutant load reductions, it does help communicate in your proposal what those measurable, tangible outcomes of your project are. Ideally, we calculate load reductions on water quality data, but if we don't have water quality data, there are models or other methods that you can use to come up with those. One of those being a tool called StepL. There's a link here to where you can access a website to look at that. It's a spreadsheet model. As the description there says, it just uses simple algorithms to calculate nutrient and sediment loads. You can use different land uses, kind of model different BMP scenarios and come up with an estimate of load reductions. That arrow is pointing to a training webinar that they gave March of 2018. That was actually a very good webinar. So if you're not familiar with StepL and you want to kind of take the first step into modeling for load reduction estimates, this is a great way to start. And I would highly recommend watching that webinar to begin with. Other modeling tools for stream restoration projects, which we commonly see, we're looking for things like cross-sections, as-built surveys, which can help indicate what the benefits are, fish surveys, Roskin methods such as the Banks Banks, BHI, and near bank stress methods to come up with load reduction estimates and environmental improvement over time. Other folks have used USDA NRCS runoff equations and kind of come up with their own model using those equations to estimate runoff and pollutant concentrations. You can do annual surveys. There's engineering estimates that you can use. Some projects with sediment just lend themselves easily to dredging and weighing on a yearly basis or every 5 years. And then for septic systems, if you're working with failing septic systems, I do have a simple spreadsheet model that you are welcome to. Calculates load reductions for E. coli, nitrogen, and phosphorus. And then finally on this subject, so we are looking for operation and maintenance over time. We are looking for a commitment to, if we spend money on these BMPs, these management measures, we want to know that they're going to be effective for a reasonable lifespan. I do not have a standard definition for reasonable lifespan, so we're just looking for some kind of common sense evaluation here that you and or the landowner will work for a reasonable period of time to make sure that those BMPs are operated and maintained so that they remain effective over the years. I used to require a follow-up monitoring protocol. I do not require that anymore. It is recommended. I used to offer bonus points on people's proposals for doing that. I'm not doing that at this point, but this attachment, this guidance in June 2018 just kind of gives you an overview of how you can go about doing that. At this point, it is recommended but not required. Okay, so back to the proposal forum. Finishing up here with a few more thoughts. Partnerships are key. This is one of the biggest areas that the task force will focus on. Have you brought all the right people to the table? Have you actively looked for other funding sources? Meaning if you're relying just on the 319 grant, they're going to be a little skeptical. They're going to want you to know that you've looked into other grant opportunities. And your partnerships include service and financial contributions. It doesn't have to be, cash contributions. It can be anybody contributing. But they really want to know who has skin in the game and are those people participating. Outreach and education component to a watershed restoration project is not required, but it is recommended, and it can be very simple. How are you getting the word out about your project? How can you encourage others to be involved? And again, be creative, learn from the past. Sometimes newsletters have been a very effective way to reach people. Sometimes it's time to try something new, so don't be afraid to think outside the box here either. Past project history. We're just looking for your history managing 319 grants. If you've not managed a 319 grant, just describe your other grant management experience. We're just looking for the confidence that you can manage the grant funds and the commitment that you can manage the grant funds. Greater sage-grouse core area protection. Per agreement with Wyoming Game and Fish Department, we do ask up front in the proposal whether or not your project is in a sage-grouse core area. And you can reference the Game and Fish Data website for maps to see if you are or are not in a core area. If you are in a core area and your project will have land disturbing activity, you do need to obtain a consultation letter from the Game and Fish and include it with your proposal. So please plan ahead. Make sure you contact Game and Fish early in the process. And again, this is only if you will have land disturbing activity in a sage-grouse core area. So if that's the case, get your consultation letter. If you're not in a core area, check the second box. Or if you don't have any land disturbing activity with your project, check that third box and you're good to go. Finally, other information is just an open section. If there's something else that we haven't asked you that you want to tell us about your project, you are welcome to put it here. There are a few special considerations. I won't go into these in detail, but please read through the memorandum. If you're doing irrigation BMPs, this would be, for example, converting flood irrigation to sprinkler irrigation. Septic systems, there's some eligibility criteria that you can read about in that memo. And then for monitoring, if you're doing microbial source tracking, there are some specific requirements to think about in terms of how you present why you're doing microbial source tracking and how you're going to do that. The budget. So let's go over the budget briefly, then I'll stop for questions. So the budget is very simple. In the past, I used to have a long workbook justification that needed to be filled out. All I'm asking for first is just the amount of funding you're requesting from us, which is line A there. Line B is how much non-federal match you'll provide. Again, for 319, you need at least 40% of the total project cost to be non-federal match. Item C there is just a sum, and the form should do that for you automatically. Other federal funds would be, if you have other federal funds contributing to the projects, you want to put that amount there, but you are not required to. This is more just FYI. So if you've got a big, say, NRCS contribution to your project, or BLM, or Forest Service, you can add it there, but you're not required to. And then finally, line E was just a total of adding those other federal funds in. So non-federal match. So let's go into that for a minute. So as the name implies, anything that's a non-federal source can qualify. And this could be a state grant, it could be private funds, and it could be landowner contributions. Cash or in kind, meaning it can be other grant funds, or it can be in kind, volunteer services or contributed equipment, anything where there's not a cash transaction, but it is a contribution to the project. The non-federal match does have to be accrued during the same time frame that your 319 project is active, and there is a 60-day look-back window. So meaning the day that your 319 agreement becomes active, plus up to about 2 months prior to that, anything within that window can be used as match. Again, 40% of total project cost is what we're looking for as the minimum non-federal match. Simple example would be $60,000 319 funds, $40,000 non-federal match for $100,000 total project cost. The simple way to calculate that is just to take your 319 amount that you're requesting and divide that by 1.5. So in that previous example, if you didn't know your total project cost was going to be $100,000, but you know that you want to request $60,000 to $319, just take $60,000 divided by 1.5. That'll give you your minimum 40% non-federal match. Just a couple websites. There is this occupational employment statistics website that can help you calculate hourly rates for certain individuals based on their career. And then the current value of volunteer time is $25.43, and you are welcome to use that hourly rate for volunteers who may be contributing to your project. And then just the real simple budget justification for the totals that you provided before, the total 319 funds you're requesting, the total non-federal match, and the other federal funds. Just looking for a breakdown here in terms of how much are going to be used for personnel, labor costs versus supplies and equipment versus contractual, and then kind of a catch-all other. Supplies and equipment. Equipment is personal property with a lifespan of more than 1 year and an acquisition cost of $5,000 or more. And again, just split out your costs between those cost categories and by 319 funds, non-federal match or other federal funds. So very simple budget justification, just looking for a brief description, explanation of what you're going to use those for. So maybe contractual is, an explanation would be, we're going to use $10,000 to hire a contractor to do the monitoring. Something like that, as one example. This is just a heads up. I won't go into too much detail here. We can pay for administrative costs under 319. For all projects, we will put a first task in that's called administration, and this is if you are recommended for funding. I'll work with you to more clearly outline project tasks and a budget justification. So we'll put in an admin task. You don't have to charge anything to admin, but you can. We've got some limitations on the amounts, basically 10% of the total 319 award and 10% of the total project cost. Don't worry about that too much now, other than just keep it in mind. And if you are recommended for funding, I'll work with you to make sure the budget comes out appropriately. Final page of the form is certification and signature, just a list of check boxes here. Really what I'm just trying to capture is a lot of the project management issues that I've run into in the past. So just a disclosure of some of the key things that you want to keep in mind if you are recommended for funding. So please read through those items. If you have any questions about those, please give me a call. Otherwise, check that you understand them and have read them. Sign and date the form. For the hard copies, you only need to have one copy with the original signature, and the electronic copy does not need to be signed. So I'll take a quick break here. For those of you on the phone, feel free to jump in with any questions. Let me just take a quick peek back here. Okay. So hopefully everything is clear as mud at this point. But if it's not, I'm not hearing any questions, so we'll just keep going. But again, if you think of something after the presentation, feel free to get a hold of me by phone or email. Okay, so we'll go into the 205J grant now, which will have a lot of similarities. So this will be a little bit quicker, but I'll go over some highlights specific to the 205J grant. So again, 205J is strictly water quality management planning. We cannot do any on-the-ground work with that funding, but any planning activities, monitoring, assessment, feasibility studies, etc., are generally eligible. Only local planning agencies can apply. In Wyoming, these are cities, counties, towns, and conservation districts. So more restricted applicant eligibility for this grant. In terms of how much we have, $40,000 is what we've got available. That's pretty static. It's per the Clean Water Act, so I don't anticipate that to go up or down. We cannot use it for any monitoring requirements of any enforcement permit or regulation. We do prioritize impaired water bodies here again. Also reimbursement only. Non-federal match component for 205J is only 25% of total project cost. Similar process for the 205J proposal, only the application form, a PDF form, is what you need, and then one or more project maps associated with the proposal. We don't want any other attachments again, don't need that Excel budget workbook as you've seen in the past, and also no letters of support, please. So I think somebody's phone went over to their hold music. Okay, great. Thank you, whoever just shut that off. Appreciate it. Okay, we'll go back to the presentation. Let's see. Okay, so again here, shortened application form, but if you are recommended for funding, I'll work with you on a more detailed plan and budget justification. This is just a 7-page PDF form. Again, same instructions as before, don't modify the format. Please use Adobe. Please download it and save it first. Mac users, please don't use Preview. The application tips will be fairly similar to what we went through for 319. So for the first page of the form that you can see here, refer back to the same guidance we talked about for the 319 proposal. Same for the second page, with the caveat that the timeframes are a little bit different. For 205J projects, it's a 2-year grant, so those projects are 2 years maximum. So for FY20 grants, you'll need to wrap up those projects by September 2022. Third page, outcomes, evaluation, partnerships, refer to the same guidance as the 319 proposal. With an additional tip that for 205J projects, what you will do with that information in the future is one of the key questions. So beyond just collecting data, my board will really want to know, what are you going to do with those data? Are you going to Then do project implementation after that. How is that data or how is this planning going to help lead to some actual water quality outcomes in the future? Monitoring, past project history, and other information, all similar to the 319 proposal, so just refer back there. Clearly think through your monitoring objectives. With planning projects, you may have broader objectives than you had with 319, so think through why you're monitoring and how you convey that to the board. Same idea for the budget. How much funding are you requesting from us? How much non-federal match are you going to provide? And then if you have any other federal funds, you can note it, but again, not required. And again, here we're only looking for 25% of total project costs being non-federal match. To quickly calculate that, just take your requested 205J amount and divide it by 3. So for example, if you applied for the full $40,000, when you divide that by 3, the minimum non-federal match that you need is $13,333. And budget justification, same idea, same 10% limits on administrative costs, so you can refer back to the previous slides there too. And same idea with the final certification and signature page. Again, contact me if any of these don't make sense. So I think I've just got a few more slides, so I'm just going to go ahead and finish up since we are getting close to the end of the hour here. Submitting your proposal, make 14 hard copies of the application packet, which for 319 will be the form, maps, and then the sage-grouse letter if applicable. 205J, just looking for the application form and the maps. No sage-grouse for 205J since it's just a planning project. Again, no other attachments. If your maps are in color, please print those in color, but everything else can be in black and white. Only one hard copy needs a signature. The rest can be copies. Please just staple them. Don't use any covers or other bindings. So you'll want to mail those hard copies or hand deliver them to me by 5 p.m. on the 20th of September. Mailing address is in the memo. And then also email me an electronic PDF of the application packet by 5 p.m. that same day. That electronic copy does not need to have a signature. And I'll send you back an email when I receive the hard copies and the electronic copy. Again, what happens from there, I will review the proposals. I will prepare my comments and provide those and the proposals to the task force members for their review. Everybody will have the opportunity to present their project at the task force meeting. As soon as I have dates, I will email that out. And they will get my comments on that evaluation form that I showed you earlier, and then they will use that scoring criteria to rate each proposal. Again, that presentation is an opportunity to explain firsthand to them why your project is important and why it should be funding. The presentation should just provide an overview, further information needed to fill in the gaps, and if you need somebody present to answer technical questions, make sure to have them there. The task force makes funding recommendations at that fall meeting. If you're recommended for funding, I'll work with you to do more of the paperwork, get ready to apply for the grant funds, and then once DEQ receives the grant funds, we'll issue an agreement with the sponsor. Once we have a signed agreement in place, you're good to go to start sending your funding. This is just the evaluation form that I mentioned. The first page is just some project information, me checking off some basic requirements. And then you'll want to pay attention if I have any additional information that I request from you that I would suggest that you include in your presentation. That's just a key area to review and make sure that you address any questions or provide any supplemental information for that. That is something the board members look at. These are the scoring matrix with the 11 criteria and then the weight for each. So pay attention to which ones are the most important. This is just the criteria restated. The ones in red are the ones that they really pay attention to the most. What does the water quality need? Why is this important to the state of Wyoming? And then secondly, who are your partners? Is everybody that should be involved in the project? The green ones are kind of the medium priority ones. Have you done your homework? Do you have a plan? Are you focusing on measurable outcomes? Are your costs reasonable? And will your project have a mechanism to evaluate effectiveness? And finally, not unimportant, but the lower tier would be, do you have an outreach and education mechanism? Can you manage the grant? Is this going to be a long-term and self-maintaining project? Is it timely and efficient? And will it benefit other resources? And again, that is available on my website, so you can review it in more detail. 205J, there is not a specific evaluation form, so you will, a scoring form, excuse me, so you'll just receive an evaluation form with my comments and any additional information requested. No scoring matrix, so a lot simpler for 205J. We're really just looking to see if your project outcomes, objectives, and tasks are reasonable and attainable. And the more that you can demonstrate to us that the products are an efficient and effective use of funds to address the water quality problem, the better chance you'll have of securing funding. I will refer you to my past annual program report and a story in that format on the website that will give you an overview of the program as well on some of our past projects that were awarded funding last year. If you're new to the program, might just help you orient to some of the specifics of what we're looking for and what was competitive. So that is all that I have. I know we're right a little bit past the hour. So I would be happy to answer any questions at this point for anybody left on the phone. Feel free to shout out, or if you can't access the chat function, I'll flip back over to the chat function and we can see if anything comes in there. Not hearing any question. Again, general questions or project-specific questions if you'd like to answer those. Or if everybody's good, maybe it was perfectly clear and everybody has a good project in mind, which if that's the case, that's great.
You did awesome, Jennifer.
Thanks, Lisa.
You got to have some comment, huh?
I appreciate it. I was hoping that I hadn't disconnected everybody. I got a little worried there for a second. So,
Jennifer, this is Haley with the town of Pinedale. Yeah, this was very helpful for us to kind of figure out how to move forward. So thank you.
Yeah, I know you guys are in a kind of unique situation there, Haley. So if you have any specific questions about your project, feel free to give me a call. So.
Okay, that sounds good. Thanks, Jennifer.
Yeah, thank you, Haley. And yeah, thanks, Lisa, for joining. And
you bet. We'll talk to you soon.
And I hope you're thinking of applying again too.
You betcha. We'll talk to you soon.
All right. Thanks, everyone. We'll talk to you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.